I am not him. My name is Bryce VanStavern. I am the Supervisor of Interpretation at the White House of the Confederacy. Our topic today, federal occupation of the Confederate White House. Now, this is a topic that is very near and dear to Eric's heart. He's been studying this for quite some time. But Eric, unfortunately, found himself unexpectedly this week needing to attend a memorial service for a colleague. So for me, that means I got Eric's notes 2 days ago, and I'm going to try to do this topic justice today. As Kelly said, we are kind of winding down the sesquicentennial portion of our Brown Bag Lunch Talks. We move into the post-war part of the sesquicentennial. And so today our topic is going to be what happens to the White House of the Confederacy after the war. We know that it becomes a military headquarters. We know that a series of generals commands from there. We're going to learn a little bit about those gentlemen today and some of the more entertaining staff members that worked here as well. I do not pretend to be able to deal with this subject completely today. Time is just not going to permit that, but hopefully this will be a pretty good little introduction to what started to happen to the House in the post-war days. Now, on the evening of April the 2nd, 1865, Jefferson Davis left the White House of the Confederacy for the last time. Richmond would soon be in flames, and by the time Davis reached Danville, Virginia, Richmond was well on its way to losing 25% of its buildings and nearly 100% of its business district. Yeah, I'm going to need that light, Sam. One of the primary reasons that the damage to Richmond was not more extensive was the arrival of the Union Army on April the 3rd, 1865. The Union Army moves into Richmond. They help to put the fires out. And by the end of that day, the first Union officers make their way to the White House of the Confederacy with the intention of making it the Richmond headquarters for the Army of the James, Major General Godfrey Weitzel commanding. Now, these officers are greeted at the house by the Davises' housekeeper, an Irish immigrant named Mary Amelia. Mary's got a bit of an interesting story. She was married to a ship's captain who perished at sea. She found herself living in Maryland, and when the war began, she was actually visiting friends here in Richmond. When she tried to get back to Maryland, she discovered she was now effectively behind enemy lines and would need a pass to get back to Maryland. Returning to Richmond, friends told her that Mrs. Davis might be able to help her. She came to the White House of the Confederacy, met Mrs. Davis. Mrs. Davis didn't offer her a pass to get back to Maryland. She offered her a job. And so Mary Amelia was the housekeeper in the house for the duration of the war. And as I said, she was here to greet those Union officers. The Davises had actually left her in charge. So the officers came in. Mary showed them around the house. Apparently, they discovered a cache of a variety of good liquors in the basement and lost no time in setting up a bar in the home's dining room. Now, the Davises had told Mary Amelia that there was no money to pay her there at the end of the war. Confederate money was virtually worthless at the time. And so she was free to take whatever she wanted from the house upon her departure. She left the Union officers in the house, taking with her a tea set, which we have since gotten back from the Amelia family, and it's on display in the house at this time. But she took a variety of other things from the pantry and headed back to Baltimore, where she had lived, as I said, before the war. So Mary Amelia becomes the first Yankee to take things from the White House of the Confederacy after the war, albeit she did have permission. Now, the next step for General Weitzel is to figure out exactly what to do with Richmond now that he was here. And this is going to be the first topic of conversation between General Weitzel and U.S. President Abraham Lincoln upon Lincoln's visit on April the 4th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln's visit to the White House of the Confederacy on April 4th is really the first major event the House would see during the Union occupation of the House. It's probably actually the biggest event the House will see during this time. Lincoln had made his intention to visit Richmond known almost immediately upon hearing of its capture, and while Secretary of War Edward Stanton expressed his concerns about the president's intentions, Lincoln let him know, "I will take care of myself." It was a difficult journey up the James River, because that's the direction Lincoln came from. He sailed up the James River. A Lieutenant Commander R. Chandler of the USS Sangamon apparently led the efforts to disable the torpedoes in the river. This was a long and arduous task that apparently was going on even as Lincoln began his sail up the James River. Now, one thing that Chandler and the Sangamon could do nothing about were the various sunken ships and things that the Confederates had placed in the James River as obstacles. And so Lincoln and his group had to sail through these obstacles. And this apparently was something of a mess, negotiating these obstacles. The maneuvers involved in this actually led to two U.S. Navy admirals, Porter and Farragut, managing to ground their vessels. But eventually, they made their way to Richmond. Upon reaching Richmond, Lincoln's party landed about where 17th or 8th Street is today. We tell everybody bottoms up pizza. If you've ever been down there, that's about, we think, where Lincoln came ashore. And here Lincoln is greeted by a sizable contingent of Richmond's enslaved African-American population. He is thronged and cheered, being hailed, among other things, as Father Abraham. Lincoln decides to circumvent the burned part of Richmond. So his journey to the White House of the Confederacy is a long and arduous one that probably took about an hour. Now, at this point, I want to make a recommendation to you, and that is this wonderful article from the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography. This was written by Park Service Ranger Mike Gorman, a fairly recent article that he wrote on Lincoln's visit to Richmond. And if you want to know about what happened with Lincoln in Richmond, terrific article to read if you can get your hands on that. But at any rate, Lincoln apparently came to the House via the scenic route, again, trying to circumvent the burned part of Richmond and the things that were happening there. But the cheering masses follow him through the streets, and it is somewhat telling that amongst the four main versions of Lincoln's visit to Richmond that we have, this is one of the only points that they all agree on. That this cheering throng of newly freed slaves cheering Lincoln followed him through the streets of Richmond to the White House of the Confederacy. As this long, dirty, and arduous walk came to an end, Lincoln found himself on the front porch of the White House of the Confederacy with the cheering masses still with him. They simply weren't going to let him go. He turned and briefly acknowledged them and then went inside. There is some speculation that Lincoln may have made a brief speech. Don't know that for sure. But Gorman seems to feel that he simply acknowledged the crowd and entered into the White House of the Confederacy. Now, Abraham Lincoln spent about 2 hours, we think, in the House. Here we see the crowd outside waiting, cheering him in this particular image. There are four primary sources that deal with Lincoln's visit to the White House of the Confederacy. One of them comes from General Weitzel himself. A New York Herald reporter named Miriam also wrote an account of Lincoln's visit to the House. One of the officer staff members, a Thomas Thatcher Graves, wrote an account, and so did Lieutenant Commander Sanford Barnes of the USS Bat, was here as well and wrote an account. Of these four accounts, only the New York Herald article happened close to the events. Actually, this was written in April of 1865. Weitzel's account is from memory in 1881, Graves in 1885, and Barnes in 1907. Now, memory is a funny thing. like I say, none of these accounts jibe in every point. One in particular that I'm going to deal with a bit later that is interesting. But at any rate, what we're going to talk about now about Lincoln's visit is going to be sort of an amalgam of these accounts, but I think I'll give you a pretty good snapshot of Lincoln's visit to the House. Upon entering the House, Lincoln was apparently shown into what today we call the library. It is a very small room on the first floor of the House, probably intended to be an office for the gentlemen of the House, but that's not what the Davises used it for. The Davises used it as a library. But the fact that it was intended to be an office, and maybe even look like an office, probably led to the understanding of those reporting the event that this room was, in fact, Jefferson Davis's office. President Lincoln was tired after his stroll. We're told he sat in an easy chair and asked, "Might I have a glass of water?" He was offered a drink from the bar, but turned that down, saying no, water would be sufficient. Apparently, Lincoln also had a light lunch. One observer called it soldier's fare, so it must have been a light lunch indeed. Now, when President Lincoln arrived, General Weitzel wasn't there. Figuring he would be given plenty of notice, General Weitzel, we think, was over at the Capitol building attending to some business and was quite taken aback when he received the news that Abraham Lincoln, in fact, was already in the city. Weitzel would write, "I received a dispatch from City Point that Mr. Lincoln had started for Richmond on the Malvern, Admiral Porter's flagship. At the time of probable arrival, and the time of probable arrival at the Rockets was given. I ordered my ambulance to be at my office in abundant time for me to reach the Rockets at the appointed hour to meet the President. I was therefore very much surprised to hear, just about the time I intended to get into my ambulance, that the President was already at my quarters. I drove as hastily as possible and found the report correct." Now, I think we can imagine Lincoln discussing a variety of things with General Weitzel. Abraham Lincoln never really wrote about his motivation for visiting Richmond and visiting General Weitzel in the House. So there are a number of reasons that might come into play. Gorman speculates that here was a wonderful opportunity for a president, apart from congressional interference, to get some post-war things happening. There are other speculations that one of the reasons that Lincoln came to Richmond was he was a politician, and he wanted to be able to go back to Washington, D.C. and talk about occupying the enemy capital. But again, Lincoln doesn't really write about this very much, and so we're left with a lot of speculation. Weitzel does talk about it in some detail, and I think that we can imagine them discussing primarily post-war issues, what might happen with Richmond, and perhaps on a grander scale, Virginia in those post-war days. Weitzel tells us simply that he and Lincoln had considerable conversation in regard to the treatment of the conquered people. The pith of his answers was that he did not wish to give me any orders on that subject, but as he expressed it, if I were in your place, I'd let him up easy. Let him up easy. Now, another pair that arrived to meet with President Lincoln were Judge John Campbell and General Joseph R. Anderson. Campbell and Anderson were hoping to begin peace proceedings, at least for Virginia, and the meetings with Campbell and Anderson most likely took place in what we call the West Parlor today. Lincoln let them know that he could not entertain such discussions as long as there were rebels still fighting in the field. Campbell told Lincoln that if he would allow the Virginia legislature to meet, that he was certain that the ordinance of secession could be repealed. And with that, Lee and every other Virginian would submit. Now, while Lincoln approved of Campbell's basic idea, he told him that the means to apply them might be difficult to discover. You see, Lincoln was wary of doing anything that would recognize the legitimacy of the Confederate government. One of the things that we let folks know here on a fairly regular basis is that the United States government never declared war on the Confederacy. The reason for that, you declare war on other nations. An actual declaration of war recognizes a government as legitimate. And the U.S. government never wanted to recognize this as anything other than a rebellion against itself. But at any rate, Lincoln was a bit concerned, apparently, that even allowing the Virginia legislature to meet might be perceived as recognizing something about the Confederacy that was legitimate. At any rate, Campbell offered to put together a group of prominent public men and to meet with Lincoln on the Malvern the next day. As I said earlier, Lincoln seems to have spent about 2 hours in the House. After that, General Weitzel says that he took the president to Libby Prison in Castle Thunder. Both were very crowded with rebel prisoners, according to Weitzel. We know that Lincoln spent time at the state capitol as well. But eventually, his time here in Richmond came to an end, and he headed back down the river to make his way to Washington. It was there on April the 14th, 1865, just 10 days after being in the White House of the Confederacy and discussing peace with General Weitzel, Judge Campbell, and General Anderson, that his life was ended by a single bullet from John Wilkes Booth's Derringer. With that single bullet, a lot of the goodwill Lincoln hoped to have during the post-war years evaporated, and feelings toward the South turned harsh. In Richmond, a succession of generals serving as military governors of Military District Number 1 would have to figure out what that meant. Now, as we go over these gentlemen, you're going to notice that by and large, we're leaving the big names of the Civil War behind, and it's entirely possible that you will never have heard of any of these fellas, perhaps a couple of exceptions. But they each got placed here to oversee a very difficult situation. And a variety of interesting things did happen during each administration. Before we ship Lincoln back to Washington, D.C., a quick sidebar right here about Lincoln's visit. Lincoln's visit provided us with what may be one of the biggest myths of the White House of the Confederacy. And that, of course, is the tale of Abraham Lincoln sitting at Jefferson Davis's desk, and depending on whose account you read, whose book you read, putting his feet on it. There are a couple of problems with this story. First of all, Jefferson Davis's actual home office was on the second floor of the house. And of the 4 accounts of Lincoln's visit to the house, only one, that of Lieutenant Commander Barnes, has Lincoln touring the entire home, including the second floor. But even if President Lincoln went to the second floor, we're not sure there was a desk there. We have a round table in that office today that we know Davis used in that space for the first half of the war anyway. The desk that we have in that office today, the actual desk in that office today, were at Davis's regular executive office over on Bank Street. There's no desk on the inventory of the house, and so we can't be sure that there was a desk in the house during this time period. At any rate, the most likely scenario, we know that Abraham Lincoln did sit in an easy chair in that small room on the first floor, and the most likely scenario is that Lincoln sat in a chair in the small library on the first floor that the federal officers had mistaken for an office. And from there, it was a short hop to Lincoln sitting at a desk in Davis's home office. And this is a post-war tale that is widely repeated and believed to this day, and believed with some passion, I might add as well, in some people. Now, we're going to begin with General Weitzel. He is the first general that was here during the war, but his tenure would be a short one. Seems he annoyed Secretary of War Stanton and was replaced fairly quickly. But from April the 3rd through April the 13th, Weitzel was actually responsible for restoring some sort of order to Richmond and setting up the military government. He set up relief efforts, including a sanitary commission, a Christian commission, and he also set up provost marshal offices, an important part of establishing a martial law in the Capitol, the governor's mansion, City Hall, and other places in what today we call downtown Richmond. Now, or I could say Weitzel, rather, is only going to be here until April the 13th when he is replaced by General Ord, Major General Edward O.C. Ord. This administration will last a bit longer, April the 13th through June 14th, 1865. And when Ord got here, this became the headquarters of the Department of Virginia. Ord was here when President Lincoln was assassinated. Because of a news blackout, that news was delayed coming to Richmond for a day or so. But upon news of President Lincoln's death, the front columns on the White House of the Confederacy were wrapped in black bunting. Ord saw Robert E. Lee ride back into Richmond and take up residence at 707 East Franklin Street. And he was also here when Joseph E. Johnston surrendered to General Sherman on April the 26th, and when Jefferson Davis was captured on May the 10th and imprisoned in Fort Monroe on May the 19th. And finally, General Ord was here when Kirby Smith surrendered his army in Galveston, Texas. Here we also see another wonderful myth of the Civil War, the idea that Jefferson Davis was captured wearing women's clothes. Again, a tale, a post-war tale, seems to have been primarily, the responsibility for that seems to have been primarily northern newspapers. But at any rate, we know that Jefferson Davis was not captured in women's clothes. You can see what he was captured with in the museum upstairs in the Confederate Years exhibit. But at any rate, General Ord saw a number of interesting things that happened while he was here. Now, another thing that happened during the federal occupation of the House, photos. Apparently, taking photos was quite the hobby at this point in time, and there are lots of photos of the House taken during the federal occupation. Let's check out a few of them here. Here we have General Ord's staff on the porch of the House. Here we have General Ord himself on the back porch of the House, leaning on the table that was at Appomattox for the surrender. Here we have General Ord and his family on the porch of the House, Mrs. Ord taking her pulse, and his child looking bright and awake for being involved in some sort of official function with her parents. And that's more like it. Now the little girl's asleep. Mrs. Ord's still taking her pulse. Don't know what's going on there. I don't think anybody would accuse General Ord of being camera shy. Certainly he had his photo taken a great deal while he was here, which, like I say, wasn't all that long. Some wonderful photos taken of the House during the war. This is one, and you can see here, and boy, I don't know why the screen is so dark, but at any rate, here we have a Union soldier. You can see him here in the photo. Across the street, some Confederate soldiers hanging out. The Union soldier is armed. The Confederate soldiers are not. Here is another image of the House with soldiers out here. One interesting part about this particular photo is that if you look closely along this wall, and you're meant to be able to see it here, it's obvious that something has been scribbled on it, and some graffiti, and it looks, I wish you could see it a little bit better, but it looks for all the world like the word rebels with a cross dashed through it. So you think about the no signs you see on the highway today, and this is something very similar. Here's another photo. Here we see the columns wrapped in black bunting after President Lincoln's death. Also a telegraph wire. That's one of the things that you're supposed to see here, a telegraph wire running up the side of the House. So a lot of interesting details from these photos. Oh, there's General Ord again, this time on the back porch of the House with him and his staff. This is a fairly well-known photo from that time. So lots of photos of the House taken during this period. Now, also on about this time, April 22nd actually, Major General Henry Wagner Halleck will be appointed commander of the military district of the James. His headquarters will be in the House as well. He's going to hold this post until June 30th, was actually demoted from lieutenant general to major general to serve in this post. He had been the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, and he has one significant contribution during his stay here. Apparently, he was contacted by Confederate General Samuel Cooper, who had all of the Confederate records that survived the fire and was part of his command, and asked Halleck if he was interested in them. And Halleck, God bless him, said, yeah. Let's hold on to those. So Halleck got a hold of all of these Confederate records. They were boxed up and became an important part of creating the official history, the records of the War of the Rebellion, as it was called at that point in time. On June the 14th, 1865, Major General Alfred Terry assumed command in Richmond. He would be here until August the 16th, 1866. Hey, he's our first guy that made it a year. Terry is here for the trial of the Lincoln conspirators and their sentencing. He is also in command when the last Confederate colors are struck from the mast of the CSS Shenandoah in Liverpool, England on November the 6th, 1865. During Terry's administration, the 13th Amendment will be ratified on December the 6th, 1865. And he is here in May of 1866 when Jefferson Davis is brought back to Richmond and indicted for treason. He resigns on August the 16th, 1866, and is replaced by this fellow, Major General John M. Schofield. Now, here at last is a name you might know if you've been to Hawaii. Schofield Barracks in Hawaii are named for this fella. He's in command here in Richmond from August the 16th, 1866 to April 26th, 1868. He is here when President Johnson declares the hostilities officially over on August the 20th, 1866, and he is here when Johnston gets himself impeached. He is reassigned on April the 26th, 1868, but Schofield offers us a fun tale in his later years. Early in President Grant's administration, Schofield served as the Secretary of War. While he was serving as Secretary of War, he decided that he would correct a great wrong. It seems that a federal officer who had served heroically in the American Civil War had failed to be awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions in that conflict. So Schofield decided to fix this. Secretary of War John M. Schofield decided to recommend for the Medal of Honor General John M. Schofield. I am not making this up, as Dave Barry likes to say. This man nominated himself for the Medal of Honor. It is the vaguest and simplest citation for a Medal of Honor ever approved. I'll read it to you in total. Was conspicuously gallant in leading a regiment in a successful charge versus the enemy. That's it. And it was approved. Interesting story here, Schofield. We will come back to him and discuss that more a bit later. But we're going to leave the heroic General Schofield behind and move on to Major General George Stoneman, in command from April the 26th, 1868 to April the 2nd, 1869. Stoneman is here when President Johnson is acquitted during his impeachment trial. He sees the 14th Amendment ratified, and he is also here when Grant is elected president. So those are the big events in Stoneman's administration. From Stoneman, we move on to this fellow right here, Alexander S. Webb, more or less. Webb is an interesting story as well. He is listed as the commander here in Richmond from April the 2nd through April the 20th, 1869. Now, several years ago, I almost bought a book simply because of its title. I thought it was a pretty clever title. It was called Showing Up for Work and Other Keys to Success. Like I say, I thought it was a clever title. I almost bought the book to read it just because of the title. I think Webb should have bought it and read it himself because while assigned, he never showed up. Webb never gets here, not once. He doesn't even show up to assume command. Apparently we don't know why this is, but whatever. He's appointed, but he never gets here. He does wind up a bit later on being appointed an instructor at West Point, where I'm sure he taught his students the importance of showing up for their duty assignments. At any rate, finally we get to Major General Edward Canby. Canby does show up for work on April the 20th, 1869, and will be here on September the 6th, until September the 6th, 1870, when the federal occupation of Richmond officially ends. Canby is here to see the creation of the Richmond public school system. It's interesting because that creation began in the White House of the Confederacy. It is Canby who will hand the keys of the house back over to the city of Richmond, and the city of Richmond will then proceed to sell off everything in the house, gut it, and use it as a school for the next 20 years. So this is really the beginning of the public school system here in Richmond. Canby is here to see Virginia's readmittance to the Union. He also sees the 15th Amendment ratified. And as I said, we'll hand the keys of the house back to the city to use as a school. Now, those are the generals that served as commanders in the house during the war. Each of these generals had a fairly large staff, and these fellows are just too numerous to name. And time simply is not going to permit us to go over them. However, there are a few that deserve mention for a variety of reasons, and I do want to cover some of these folks. The first one is one that is very near and dear to our heart, this fella here, Colonel Thomas Erskine Barker of the 12th New Hampshire Infantry. Colonel Barker enlisted, excuse me, at the beginning of the war. He quickly rose through the ranks to company command. And he found himself here in Richmond during Ord's administration and maybe the early days of General Terry. Now, one of the things that we are constantly asked about in the House is Union officers vandalizing the House during the occupation. And I love to point out to people that no, it's not likely that officers are going to vandalize the former home of the Confederate president when it is now the home of a U.S. Army Major General. However, these officers did liberate a variety of things from the house. Nothing major, really. It's difficult to pick up a chair and run out with it when, like I say, there's a major general sitting in it telling you to leave it alone. But if it's something that could be put in a pocket or tucked under an arm, well, there are just many things that walked out of that house on blue trousered legs. And Colonel Barker's is one of our favorites. Colonel Barker found himself charmed by this thing. It is a hot water dispenser that most likely was in the dining room. That's where it is now. But at any rate, Colonel Barker packed this thing away and went back to New Hampshire with it. Years later, this treasure made its way back to the museum, courtesy of the Barker family. Now, identifying it was pretty much a slam dunk because it is now engraved on its lid. We don't know exactly when this happened, but at some point in time, this little dispenser was engraved on its lid, and you can see a little bit of it here. But in toto, what that reads, Colonel Barker's Civil War loot from Jefferson Davis's house, 1865. No doubt about that one. Like I say, Colonel Barker, one of our favorite characters here in the house, primarily because of that little thing there. Here's another one of our characters, an interesting fellow that served as aide-de-camp to General Weitzel. His name is Thomas Thatcher Graves. He provides us with one of the accounts of Lincoln's visit. After his time in service, it's what happened to Graves after his service here that's interesting. He went to Harvard Medical School, and he opened up a medical practice in New England and was successful with this during the 1870s and 1880s. Ultimately, though, his career wound up in ruins. The reason for that, in 1890, one of his patients, a wealthy widow by the name of Mrs. Josephine Barnaby, died of poisoning. The investigators traced the bottle of poisoning back to Dr. Graves' office. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Dr. Graves had been the power of attorney for Mrs. Barnaby. And while serving in this capacity, he apparently enjoyed spending Mrs. Graves' money rather willy-nilly. But when she wrote her will, he was dismayed to discover that he was not listed as her beneficiary. Aha! Opportunity, motive, weapon, that does it. Now, Graves denied any involvement in Mrs. Graves' poisoning. The jury was not convinced. And Graves was found guilty of murder in 1892. A year after this, a judge declared a mistrial and a second trial was ordered. Never happened because Dr. Graves committed suicide. He left 2 notes. The first, again, insisting upon his innocence. The second note, oddly, contained instructions for the coroner. It read, "Please don't hold an autopsy on my remains. The cause of my death may be rendered as follows: died from persecution, worn out, exhausted." Dr. Graves. There's this fellow here, chief engineer for both Ord and Halleck. This fellow was named Peter Smith Mitchie. He graduated from West Point in 1863. Must have been a fine officer. He finished the war lieutenant colonel and brevet brigadier general. After the war, he reverted to his permanent rank of first lieutenant and was largely responsible for creating the post-war map of Richmond with nearly every single remaining building in place. So interesting fellow there. And there's even, you can see here again, see it really well, the drawing of the White House property that Mitchie included on his map. I also want to get to Lieutenant Commander Barnes here, again, the commander of the BAT that helped get Lincoln up the James River to Richmond. Barnes was one of the first graduates of the Naval Academy, graduated in 1854, would eventually teach seamanship at the Naval Academy's practice ships Marblehead and Savannah. After leaving the Navy, he apparently did very well in the railroad industry and did start the Naval History Society right before he died in 1911. So again, these are some of the characters involved in this story and some interesting things that happened to them. Back to the commanders. What happened to these fellows in their twilight years? Well, here's General Weitzel. He would wind up commanding the District of the Rio Grande after the war, but eventually reverted to his permanent rank of Major of Engineers. His engineering education was put to good use, designing lighthouses, primarily on the Great Lakes. Out of curiosity, anybody know what state in the Union has the largest number of lighthouses? Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, but it's Michigan. I'll do a talk on lighthouses one day too. But it is Michigan. Has the largest number of lighthouses in the United States. But a couple of them on the shores of Minnesota were designed by General Weitzel here. He died in Philadelphia with the rank of lieutenant colonel in 1884. General Ord held 5 separate departmental commands before retiring from the Army in 1880 as a brigadier general. He was promoted back to Major General upon his retirement in 1881. He died in 1883. General Halleck retained his rank of Major General and commanded the Military Division of the Pacific and Department of the South. This guy never retired. He died still on active duty in 1872. From there on to General Terry. He was an attorney before the war, but decided to stay in the Army. He's got one interesting little piece to his later life. He was made the commander of the Department of the Dakotas when a little altercation took place between one of his generals, a George Armstrong Custer, and some Native Americans in the area. Suffice it to say, those natives were not selling what General Custer were not buying what General Custer was selling, and let him know in the strongest terms. Retiring in 1888, General Terry died in 1890. General Schofield, we've already mentioned that he was Secretary of War in Grant's administration, at least in the early part of that administration, eventually wound up General-in-Chief of the Army. He did successfully correct the wrong of never having been awarded the Medal of Honor, and he died in 1906. Now, again, we got a bit of a legacy from this fellow. The U.S. Army barracks in Hawaii were named for him. Now, those barracks were attacked by aircraft of the Imperial Japanese Navy on December the 7th, 1941. Marks from the Japanese bullets can still be seen in those buildings to this day. So it seems possible that the building named for him may have served more gallantly than the general himself. Don't know about that. General Stoneman left the Army in 1871, later served as railroad commissioner, became the governor of California in 1883, and he died in 1894. General Webb, our no-show, left the Army, became president of the City College of New York in 1869, held this position for 33 years. A monument to him is erected on those grounds today. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions at Gettysburg in 1891, and he died in 1911. General Canby stayed in the Army after Richmond, took command of the Department of Columbia, which included the Pacific Coast and Alaska. While attempting to broker a peace treaty with the Modoc Nation in 1873, Canby was shot in the face at point-blank range by the Modoc chief, Captain Jack, and was killed instantly. Canby apparently had no better luck than Custer in dealing with the natives. So we come to the close of this part of the history of the White House of the Confederacy. As I said when I began, I make no pretense that this is the entire story. Eric is certainly the expert on this, and I'll say everything that I've told you today, a lot of what I've told you today comes from his notes. Obviously, the story of Reconstruction is a very complex story that we can't really cover in any great detail in this setting. I hope, though, that we have introduced you, done a job at introducing you to what happened here in those post-war years, and also introducing you to the men who oversaw that process here in Virginia. Not a lot of household names in this batch, but each one of them played their part in following through with the Reconstruction period in these immediate post-war years. They oversaw the rebuilding of Richmond. They got aid societies established, and in general, helped the city of Richmond, and maybe even Virginia, and maybe even the South, and maybe even the United States back on its feet after the war. They're also a good example of the type of veterans that we think of and honor today. Not always war heroes, but these are the men, the soldiers, that simply stand guard and do the job day in and day out. Like I say, these are the men that helped put America back together. Now, again, not Eric. I am certainly no expert on this, but I will entertain questions if you have any. If I don't know, I'm afraid I'm going to tell you I don't know. Again, let me recommend to you Mike Gorman's article, A Conqueror or Peacemaker, Abraham Lincoln in Richmond, which can be found in the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography. Terrific article if you want to know about Lincoln's visit to Richmond.